On June 22, 1941, the world witnessed one of the most monumental and devastating military operations in history, Operation Barbarossa. This was not just another offensive but the manifestation of Adolf Hitler's deep-seated ideology, driven by his fervent desire to obliterate Soviet communism, which he saw as the greatest threat to his vision of a German-dominated Europe. In the early hours of that fateful day, over 3.8 million Axis soldiers, comprising Germans, Romanians, Finns, Hungarians, and Italians, surged across a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The sheer scale of the invasion was unparalleled, marking it as the largest military operation in history. The Soviet Union, though vast and populous, was caught off guard. Stalin, having recently purged his military leadership of anyone he deemed a threat, left the Red Army weakened and unprepared for the onslaught that was about to unfold. The German strategy was as bold as it was ambitious, focusing on three primary objectives: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Kiev in the south. These cities were not only symbolic but also strategically vital. The Germans believed that by capturing these key locations, they could break the Soviet Union's back, forcing it to collapse under the weight of its internal weaknesses. In the north, Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb led Army Group North on a lightning advance towards Leningrad. Within the first month, his forces had surged nearly 500 miles, coming within 135 miles of the city. At the same time, Hitler's Finnish allies launched their own offensive from the north, attempting to cut off the city from the rest of the Soviet Union. In the center, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock commanded Army Group Center in a relentless drive towards Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union. The speed and efficiency of this advance were staggering. In just a few short weeks, von Bock's forces covered over 480 miles, capturing many of the Soviet Union's key cities along the way. By mid-July, Smolensk, the gateway to Moscow, had fallen into German hands. This victory, however, came at a cost. The Red Army, though battered, began to show signs of resistance, slowing the German advance. Further south, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South cut through the rich agricultural lands of Ukraine. The vast plains, known as the breadbasket of Europe, were quickly overrun by the German war machine. With each passing day, it seemed increasingly likely that the Soviet Union was on the brink of total collapse. The Ukrainian population, brutalized by Stalin's collectivization policies, offered little resistance, and some even welcomed the Germans as liberators. By late September 1941, the Germans believed that final victory was within their grasp. Operation Typhoon, the codename for the assault on Moscow, was launched on September 30th. Army Group Center, now bolstered by reinforcements, was ordered to smash through the Soviet defensive lines and take the Soviet capital. The initial German success was undeniable. The 2nd Panzer Group, led by General Heinz Guderian, captured the city of Orel, just 75 miles south of Moscow's main defensive line. Days later, Bryansk fell, encircling large Soviet formations and leaving the road to Moscow seemingly open. In the north, the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies, advancing towards Vyazma, managed to trap 4 entire Soviet armies in a massive encirclement, capturing over 663,000 Soviet soldiers. By the end of October, the Germans had taken a total of 3 million prisoners since the start of the campaign. Stalin, facing the possibility of Moscow falling, prepared to make his last stand with a meager force of 800,000 men. However, only 25 of his 83 divisions were fully operational, and many lacked the equipment and training to stand up to the seasoned German forces. As the Germans pushed closer to Moscow, the weather began to change. Heavy rains in late October turned the Russian roads into a quagmire of mud, slowing the German advance to a crawl. The German tanks, designed for the roads of Western Europe, struggled in the mire, and logistical problems began to mount. On October 31st, the Germans were forced to call a temporary halt to regroup and resupply. This pause, however, gave the Soviets a crucial window of opportunity. Stalin, never one to shy away from drastic measures, ordered the formation of 11 new armies, which included 30 divisions of hardened Siberian troops. These soldiers, better equipped and trained for winter warfare, began arriving in Moscow just as the first snowfalls blanketed the city. Along with them came over 1,000 tanks, providing the Soviet defenders with much-needed firepower. On November 15, with the ground frozen solid, the Germans resumed their advance. The plan was to encircle Moscow from the northeast and the south, with the 3rd and 4th Panzer armies crossing the Moscow-Volga Canal and the 2nd Panzer Group attacking Tula before closing in on Moscow from the south. The German High Command believed that this pincer movement would force the Soviet armies to shift their focus, allowing the 4th Army to strike directly at the city center. For 2 grueling weeks, the Germans inched closer to Moscow, often advancing just a few miles a day. Fuel and ammunition were in short supply, and the harsh Russian winter began to take its toll on both men and machines. On November 22, the Soviet Siberian divisions launched a fierce counterattack against the 2nd Panzer Group, halting its advance. Despite this setback, the 4th Panzer Group managed to cross the Moscow-Volga Canal, reaching the last major obstacle before the city. By late November, the Germans were within striking distance of Moscow. The 7th Panzer Division, part of the 4th Panzer Group, advanced to just 22 miles from Red Square and the Kremlin. Yet, the closer they got, the stiffer the Soviet resistance became. On November 28, a powerful Soviet counterattack drove the Germans back, marking the high point of their advance. To the northwest, the Germans reached Krasnaya Polyana, now known as Lobnya, a mere 18 miles from the Kremlin. But once again, Soviet resistance, combined with the Germans' worsening supply situation, brought their advance to a standstill. The 258th Infantry Division, part of the German forces in the area, did manage to push slightly closer, and a small group of panzer pioneers reportedly reached the town of Khimki, just 14 miles from the Kremlin. German officers claimed they could see the golden domes of Red Square and the Kremlin through their binoculars. However, this story is likely exaggerated. Moscow in 1941 was not a city of towering skyscrapers, and the Kremlin spires, while prominent, were not visible from such a distance, especially considering the Soviet efforts to camouflage them. Red Square and the Kremlin had been meticulously disguised to avoid detection by German reconnaissance planes. The golden spires were painted over, the Kremlin walls were made to resemble ordinary buildings, and even Lenin's mausoleum was transformed to look like a 2-story residential block. In reality, what the Germans likely saw were reflections of snow and frost on distant rooftops, or perhaps other church domes in the direction of the city center. Khimki, in 1941, was a modest town with no tall buildings to offer an elevated view of Moscow's skyline. Nevertheless, Khimki would go down in history as the closest point to Moscow reached by German forces. On December 2, the small German force in Khimki, isolated and without support, was forced to retreat under pressure from a Soviet counterattack led by local militia and a few T-34 tanks. The German dream of capturing Moscow was slipping away. Today, the furthest point of the German advance is marked by a memorial of giant Czech tank traps at kilometer 23 on the Leningradskoye Highway, just outside Moscow. As December wore on, the full fury of the Russian winter descended upon the German forces. Temperatures plummeted, supplies dwindled, and the men, ill-equipped for such conditions, began to suffer from frostbite and exhaustion. On December 5, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, driving the Germans back. By January 7, 1942, when the Soviet advance finally halted, the Germans had been pushed back between 60 and 150 miles from Moscow. The battle for Moscow was over, and with it, Hitler's hopes for a quick victory in the east were dashed. The Soviet Union, bloodied but unbowed, had survived its darkest hour, and the tide of war began to turn. Operation Barbarossa, which had begun with such promise for the Germans, would ultimately lead to their downfall, as the Eastern Front became a grinding war of attrition that the Wehrmacht could not win.